It was here before the scriptures were carved, before the temples rose and the word God was spoken with fear. It had no name for itself, prophets or commandments, nor did it demand faith, but fire and blood. Born in the soil, it lived in the frost on the trees, in the howl of the wolf, in the curve of the moon. And though empires rose to silence it and holy books condemned it, though history buried it, it waited in the shadows, never truly gone. If you too are waiting in the shadows, then check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide, ad rated excellent on Trustpilot, linked in the description. Before the gods had names, they were the cold of the cave, the smoke in the lungs, the crack of bones in the fire. They were seasons, cycles, and in the oldest human memory, there was no separation between the sacred and the world. The sacred was the world. Tens of thousands of years ago, under flickering firelight, our ancestors painted on the walls of caves, art for ritual, survival, invocation. In Lascaux, in Chauvet, in Altamira, they filled caverns with bison, horses, stags, hands, dots, spirals. Some were layered for generations, some were only visible when lit from a certain angle. This was religion, magic. To paint an animal was to summon it, to call it into the world again. These early people buried their dead with care. Ochre-covered bones, antlers, ivory beads, weapons and food laid beside corpses. In Sangir, Russia, a child was buried in a robe stitched with thousands of mammoth ivory beads. In Dolny Viestonice, a woman lay with a deformed pelvis and a fox's jaw placed beside her head. These are the rituals of a people sending them somewhere. Among the most haunting relics are the Venus figurines, small, faceless carvings of women with swollen bellies, wide hips, heavy breasts, found from France to Siberia. They seem to speak a language beyond words. Some may have represented fertility, others death, perhaps both. In a world ruled by turning seasons, life and death were one movement, one breath in, one breath out. This is Animism, a belief that everything lives. Rivers, rocks, mountains, storms, a tree watches, a cave remembers. Spirits moved through the land like weather, and every action had a consequence. You didn't kill without offering, you didn't cross without asking. To navigate this world, there were shamans, intermediaries between the seen and the unseen. They wore antlers, danced in firelight, entered trance through drumming, fasting and plants. They journeyed beyond the body and returned changed, marked, liminal, people between worlds. And from this world view, ritual sites began to rise, places of alignment, places where stone met sky. Göbekli Tepe, built over 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture, a circle of massive stone pillars carved with vultures, foxes, scorpions, a place of gathering, a place of offering. At Stonehenge, great slabs were dragged for miles and set to mark the solstices, light falling on stone, a calendar, a ceremony, a reminder that time itself was sacred. And there were no pantheons or wars in heaven, but there was meaning, there was awe. And long before belief was written, it was felt. Before the gods spoke in any language, they whispered in ash and bone. Before they had names, they had presence. When cities rose, the gods were given thrones. As civilizations began to form along rivers, in fertile valleys, across floodplains, the gods became rulers, builders, judges, and scribes. Their temples stood at the center of the world. Their words became law. In Sumer, one of the oldest known civilizations, the gods lived among the people. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Eridu each had a patron deity. They were thought to actually reside in the temple, to dwell in their sanctuaries, tended to by priests who bathed them, clothed them, and brought daily offerings. Inanna ruled from Uruk, fierce and radiant, goddess of love, sex, and war. Her rituals were ecstatic, her presence both fertile and dangerous. Enki, lord of the waters, brought wisdom and magic from his subterranean domain, the Abzu. Utu, the god of the sun, oversaw justice. His gaze saw all things. These gods, they administrated, the architects of reality itself. Their power was reflected in the ziggurat, stepped towers of clay and stone rising above the plains. They were bridges between earth and sky. Offerings made at these temples were the sustenance for the gods, who in return were expected to provide abundance, fertility, and victory. The relationship was reciprocal and absolutely central to life. In Egypt, the divine order was even more absolute. The concept of Ma'at held the universe in balance, truth, justice, and harmony. Every sunrise reaffirmed it. Every act of the pharaoh upheld it. He was a god, the living Horus, and when he died, he became Osiris, ruler of the underworld. The gods of Egypt were many: Ra, the sun's fire; Anubis, the guardian of the dead; Thoth, the scribe of destiny. Temples along the Nile mirrored celestial patterns. Rituals followed strict calendars. The Book of the Dead was a map. To the west, the Canaanites worshipped a storm god named Baal, whose voice was thunder and whose strength brought the rains. His battles with Mot, the god of death and drought, shaped the seasons. In Ugaritic texts, we find some of the earliest myths of dying and returning gods, gods who descend into darkness and rise again with the rains. These stories explain survival. When Baal died, the crops failed. When he returned, life resumed. Further north, the Hittites preserved similar myths. Their storm god fought the serpent Iluyanka, a chaos dragon from the deep. This recurring image of storm god versus serpent mirrors across the ancient world. Order versus chaos, sky versus abyss. It would later be inherited and rewritten by other faiths, but here it was agricultural, and it was real. Meanwhile, the Indo-European migrations carried with them a structure that would spread from India to Ireland. A sky father, a thunder god, a god of contracts of fire. These figures would evolve into Zeus, Jupiter, Indra, Percunes, and Thor. Each carried a weapon, each ruled part of existence. The Pantheon was born through a shared idea, refracted through culture and landscape. These gods became stories. Their myth explained floods, harvests, storms, war, birth, love, and death. They married, fought, created, and destroyed. Each had a function, a realm, a personality. The divine became comprehensible by being divided. To understand the world was to understand its gods. Temples grew larger. Rituals became institutional. The priesthood emerged as a power in its own right. Sacrifices, once spontaneous acts of reverence, became formalized. Grain, incense, wine, animals, in some places humans. The offering was an exchange. To feed the god was to ensure prosperity. To neglect the god was to invite ruin. The Pantheon was a reflection of the world now being built, ordered, stratified, expansive. The gods had names, they had temples, they had voices in clay tablets and stone carvings, and through them, humanity had begun to place itself at the center of a system where even the heavens could be negotiated. By the first millennium BCE, myth was strategic. It shaped cities, justified power, and travelled wherever armies, trade routes, and language spread. Civilizations built narratives to hold them together, and at the centre of those narratives were gods, now part of law, architecture, and memory. In Vedic India, the sacred had become structured. The Rig Veda, composed in archaic Sanskrit, preserved hundreds of hymns honouring gods like Indra, Agni, and Varuna. Indra was the warrior who split the skies and released the rivers. Agni was fire, yes, but also the messenger between mortals and gods, present in every sacrificial flame. The rituals were exact, guarded by Brahmin priests whose role was to maintain the harmony of the universe. Soma, consumed during these rites, was believed to grant immortality and insight. Its origins, part plant, part mystery, were less important than what it revealed. Everything was precise, measured. Ritual was how the world stayed intact. In the Greek world, mythology took on new complexity. The Olympian gods ruled from above, but they were fallible, emotional, involved in mortal affairs. Their myths, reflections of human ambition, desire, and hubris. Temples honored them, festivals celebrated them, and oracles spoke their will. At Delphi, the Pythia, seated above a chasm in the earth, inhaled vapors and answered questions for kings and commoners alike. But alongside this civic religion, mystery cults flourished, secretive, initiatory traditions that promised knowledge not of this world, but the next. At Eleusis, inmates walked in silence, carrying torches into the dark. At Samothrace, rites were performed to protect sailors. In the cult of Dionysus, identity dissolved in frenzy. Rome, on the other hand, turned religion into infrastructure. Their gods mirrored the Greek Pantheon in name and function, but Roman religion was built on discipline, duty, and control. Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, had to be maintained through correct ritual. Failure to perform a rite properly could bring disaster to the state. Augurs read the flight of birds before any military campaign. Vestal virgins tended to the eternal flame that ensured Rome's safety, and as Rome expanded, it absorbed the gods of conquered peoples. Egyptian Isis, Persian Mithras, Anatolian Cybele were all brought into the Roman fold, reshaped to serve the empire. Beyond the reach of literacy and empire, myth thrived in other forms. In the forests and riverlands of northern and western Europe, Germanic, Norse, and Celtic beliefs were passed in breath. In the Germanic world, the sacred groves were places of law and binding oaths. The gods here walked beside warriors and judged their courage. Woden, not Odin yet, with his one eye and endless hunger for knowledge, traded comfort for insight. Tivas presided over honor and justice. These gods were ingrained into the very structure of clan and kin. Among the Celts, myth bled into landscape. Gods were rivers, hills, weapons. Lu, a warrior of all skills, was honored during Lughnasadh, at the start of the harvest. Brigid governed healing, poetry, and the forge. The Morrigan haunted battlefields, a phantom crow watching over the fate of armies. Druidic orders preserved this law. To remember was sacred. Memory was power. Everywhere, myth served empire, but not always the same empire. In Greece, it shaped the theatre and the polis. In Rome, it reinforced conquest and law. In India, it held the universe in balance. And in the north, it tied people to place, to kin, and to gods who never asked for temples, only remembrance. As the 1st century approached, myth stood at its zenith. It lived in carved stone, in fire-lit rituals, in stories. The old gods still reigned, in temples and forests alike. But a storm was coming, and in the next age, the stories would begin to fracture. By the 1st century, the gods still reigned, but something beneath the surface had begun to shift. In 312 CE, the Emperor Constantine crossed into a battle under the sign of a god who had not yet conquered, and won. That victory became the hinge of a new world because he now served a purpose on earth. Paganism was scattered, tribal, decentralized. Christianity, however, spoke with one voice, one God, one church, one authority. It began as favor, then power, then law. By the end of the 4th century, the temples were closed, sacrifices forbidden, public rites declared treason. What had once been the foundation of the empire was now its enemy. Paganism was outlawed, and the gods, after centuries of worship, were cast out by decree. In the cities, statues were torn down or quietly rebranded. Marble gods that once towered above marketplaces were buried beneath cathedrals or smashed in streets. Sacred fires were extinguished, oracle sites abandoned, ritual calendars torn from time. The world had been reordered, and the gods no longer had a place in it. But belief does not vanish at the sound of a law. It retreats. In the countryside, far from the reach of imperial courts, the rites continued. Fields were still blessed in spring, fires were lit at midwinter. Offerings were left at wells and trees, not openly, but still there. In the land, in the hands, in the breath between generations. In Gaul, former temples were turned into churches, but the people still walked the same paths, carried the same offerings, and made the same silent gestures toward the old stones. Iberian hilltop shrines were rededicated to saints, but only after the old gods had been chased out. Where the gods of Egypt had survived for millennia, their temples fell into ruin, emptied, defaced, or buried under layers of Christian stone. Among the Germanic tribes, the old gods continued to rule, but pressure was mounting. Rome had fallen, but its new religion had spread through missionaries and kings. The gods were renamed. Wodan became a shadow. Donna was cast as a devil. Groves were cut down to make a point. The church understood. The land itself remembered. So the land had to be reshaped. In the Norse world, paganism held firm. Thor's hammer was carved into grave markers, worn as amulets, etched into wood and stone. Odin was sought through poetry and trance. He offered visions in exchange for pain. The gods here, they fought to remain. In the forests of the Baltic, Pacunas still cracked the sky. The gods were immediate, dangerous, and present. Rituals were held away from the roads, away from the church's reach. The fire was fed, the thunder answered. Among the Western Slavs, the divine was seen in land and season. The gods of harvest were honored in communal rites, offerings were buried, trees were dressed, rites were still performed for necessity. The crops still needed blessing, the dead still needed guidance. Christianity had arrived, but it hadn't settled. The old gods were still here. In Ireland, the gods became stories. The Tuatha De Danann were called ancient rather than false, mysterious, powerful. Bridget became a saint, but her well still healed. The mounds still whispered. The veil had been drawn, but what lay behind it had not moved. Everywhere else, though, the price of remembrance grew higher. Public rites vanished, names fell out of use. Children were no longer told the myths, or if they were, it was in secret, in softened form. A god became a story became a warning became silence. By the 8th century, what remained of paganism had become harder to see because it was hidden, carried in posture, in hesitation, in unspoken reverence shown to a tree, a stone, a river no longer named in public. By the end of the first millennium, paganism had lost its institutions, its temples were rubble, its priesthoods had vanished, its names were fading. Its names had faded, its stories had blurred, But by the dawn of the 19th century, something began to stir in the ruins. In the age of Romanticism, artists, poets, and scholars turned their eyes backward in search of power. The ruins of temples were seen as sublime. The shattered columns of Greece and Rome, the carved stones of the Norse, the songs of the Celt. They called to something deeper than history. They offered a vision of a world untamed by the church, unbound by reason. The Norse Eddas, once forgotten, were rediscovered and translated. In them, gods and giants roared across the sky that felt still alive. Thor's hammer struck once more. Odin spoke again. The Celtic revival unearthed myths of warrior queens, dream visions, and otherworldly hosts. Greek temples, long buried or broken, were unearthed from beneath fields and cities, columns rising again under modern skies. These were cultural awakenings. The gods had returned. Folklorists began to document what had never been fully erased. In villages, in woods, the remnants of older rites still lingered. Jakob Grimm collected fairy tales, rituals, charms, and seasonal customs, each one carrying traces of gods and spirits, preserved within the language of story. James Fraser, in The Golden Bough, traced echoes of fertility rites, kingship, and sacrifice across cultures and centuries. Margaret Murray proposed that the so-called witches of Europe had been practitioners of an ancient suppressed religion, one that had never truly died, only been hunted. The old gods were being reinterpreted. And in the space between myth and ritual, new movements began to form. Theosophy reached east and west at once, blending Hindu cosmology with esoteric interpretations of pagan tradition. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn built intricate magical systems using gods from Egypt, Greece, and Norse, stripped from context, reassembled into a new pattern. Aleister Crowley invoked Isis and Horus in his rites as living forces, reawakening through word and will. It was a rebirth, but a strange one. The gods were now invoked by those who didn't always believe in them. Rituals were created from scraps and visions. The past was no longer remembered, it was reconstructed. Paganism had returned, but as something newly shaped. A system reconstructed from fragments, a mythology reborn through longing, study, and will. For some, a path. For others, a symbol. In the decades that followed, it became a lived tradition again. The shift began in post-war Britain. Gerald Gardner, a retired civil servant with ties to esoteric orders, began to write about and perform rituals he called Wicca, drawing from ceremonial magic, British folk customs, the writings of Aleister Crowley, and his own experience. He offered something new, yet ancient in feeling. It honoured both a horned god and a mother goddess. It followed seasons, marked the solstices and equinoxes, the waxing and waning of the moon. With the help of Doreen Valiente, Wicca gained structure and coherence. There was initiation, secrecy, and there was power. Wicca spread as an idea that paganism could be modern, conscious, and spiritually valid, and others began to follow this thread. Druidry re-emerged, inspired by romantic visions of the ancient Celts and the landscape of the British Isles. Rather than a direct continuation of historical Druids, it carried their spirit into a new age. Nature, poetry, and the scarcity of the land became central. In parallel, heathenry rose among those drawn to the Norse and Germanic traditions. Sagas were read, blots and sumbels were held. Some focused on reconstruction, while others took a more devotional approach. In Greece, Hellenic paganism returned, offering libations to Zeus, Hera, and Athena. In Egypt, modern Kemetic practitioners honored the Netjer, the gods and goddesses of a civilization long buried. These revivals were diverse in method. Some sought to reconstruct ancient rites with archaeological precision. Others forged new paths, guided by vision, feeling, and personal experience. Across them all, one truth held. Paganism had survived long enough to be reborn, and with rebirth came transformation. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s found powerful resonance in goddess spirituality. The goddess became political, personal, embodied. She was seen in the moon, the womb, the earth. Books like The Spiral Dance by Starhawk combined Wicca, activism, and eco-spirituality into a living, breathing practice. Gaia theory, proposed by James Lovelock and embraced by spiritual thinkers, cast the planet itself as a living organism, a deity worthy of reverence. Then came the internet, and everything changed again. What had once been solitary or limited to local covens now became a global conversation. Early message boards and forums allowed practitioners across continents to share rituals, discuss theology, and challenge each other. Solitaries found community. Fringe paths found names. Traditions cross-pollinated. From Reconstructionists to Chaos magicians, Druids to Hellenists, a sprawling network of belief took root. This new paganism offered a path shaped by will, imagination, and relationship with the land, the ancestors, the self, and the unseen. Modern paganism isn't one thing. It's prayer and protest. It's ritual and reinvention. It is sacred text written in the present tense, and though it reaches for the past, it walks fully in the now. So where do we go from here? The gods now move through fiber optics and satellites, slipping between signal and screen. They appear in playlists, in games, in shows. Paganism now drifts across timelines, algorithms, and augmented rituals where incense meets interface. So what comes next? Perhaps we build digital templates that outlast our cities. Perhaps ancestral spirits are channeled through synthetic speech. Perhaps rituals are synchronized across continents by satellite time, as the old rites are made new through code. Offerings uploaded, hymns written by algorithms trained on ancient tongues, gods born in the feedback loop of belief and bandwidth. Or maybe the future turns back, forests reclaimed, shrines rebuilt in stone, the sacred found in deer tracks and frozen earth. The gods encountered once more, raw, unnamed, and near. Paganism won't follow a single path. It never did. It waits for breath, for reverence, for contact. It becomes whatever the world needs it to become. And in the centuries to come, whether in code or carved into bark, one truth will remain. It never vanished, only changed shape, and will do so again.